Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Coaching Call podcast. On this podcast, we'll cover various types of coaching by trainers in sports, martial arts, fitness, and business. We'll discuss each coach's methods to getting the most out of their respective athletes or clients and how they attempt to change the platform in which they coach. Join us on a fun adventure as we discuss unique coaching styles. Coaching is a universal part of how we get others to get something done. Join your host, Rafael, and his guests on this unique journey in coaching.
Hi, I'm Sifu Rafael, and this is the Coaching Call podcast. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. This episode was made possible by listeners like you. Scott, good morning. My goodness, I am so happy to have you on the show. Welcome to Coaching Call.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm actually looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, likewise. So we met because of the Connected Leaders Academy. I'm so thrilled to be part of it, right?
Absolutely.
So Scott, one of the ways that I get personally to know you, even in conversation, if we're in front of each other, I would always want to know about your childhood. So let's go there. Where were you born?
Yeah, I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. No, wait, that's Abraham Lincoln. Sorry. I was actually born in Houston, Texas. I was there until I was probably in the fourth grade. We actually lived first in Houston and then in a town called Friendswood. Friendswood at the time was where all the NASA engineers lived. So like literally all of my neighbors and all of the kids I played with, their mom and dad were NASA engineers. My dad worked for Sears. So it was kind of, it was hilarious. We were like the only non-engineers on the block. It was an interesting place to grow up.
Well, and sometimes going into Sears was like being in a NASA astronaut. Those things were so big.
Yeah, my dad worked for the credit department. So he actually, his job was to go find people that owed money on their bill basically for a long time. And then eventually he worked himself, he's kind of a manager for that. And then later he ran his own business. It was still Sears, but do you remember back in the day when they had the catalog sales stores? You could go in and order from the catalog? He ran one of those in a small town called Pleasanton near San Antonio.
Wow.
When I was younger, when we were I was in about fourth grade, we moved to San Antonio and then to Pleasanton. And my mom became a teacher there in town. My dad ran the Sears store. And pretty much that's where we lived. I graduated high school there. That was where we lived. I consider myself from Pleasanton, even though I was born in Houston, because that's kind of where I spent most of my life and a good part of my formative years.
Very cool. So who would you say, up to high school, who would you say were some of your biggest influences for you?
My mom. That by far. My mom and I are a lot alike. We have a very similar personality types. We have similar styles. I learned a lot by watching her. She was a teacher. She eventually became a vice principal and then a principal of a school. At the time, she was one of the few females in the administration. It was all men. And she learned how to manage the system in a way, and the way she interacted with people, the way she would do things. And I learned a lot from watching her in terms of, she didn't run at things like full speed ahead, bash her head through the wall. She would influence the situation where at the end of the day, she would get what she needed, but she did it without a lot of conflict or a lot of fighting or a lot of anger. And it was interesting to watch her do that and learn from that. I think that's part of what influenced now, as a coach, that's what influenced part of the way I approach coaching as well.
Nice. So your mom had a big influence on you. Talk to me. Did you have siblings, or what was that like?
I had an older sister. She's 4 years older than me, and we did not get along when we were growing up. We didn't actually get along until we were both fairly mature adults. It took us a long time to kind of get to that point. And it was really because, looking back on it, our personality types and our styles were completely different. We grew up, my father was an alcoholic and a prescription drug abuse prescription drugs and that kind of thing. So we were growing up in a household with a lot of stress and a lot of strain, and the way each of us handled that was completely different and kind of rubbed each other the wrong way, even though looking back on it, it was because we were both dealing with the external stress coming from my dad. But neither one of us processed that really healthily until you reach adulthood and kind of go back in time to process what happened as a child, if that makes sense. I don't think it's easy to do that when you're a kid.
No, it's not. It's not, because you're going through your own turmoil, if you will.
Yeah.
So would you say your family life at that point, when your dad was abusing drugs and things of that nature, more of chaotic?
It really wasn't
Oh, that's good.
chaotic. It wasn't outwardly chaotic, because a lot of times, and this I've found now working with people over the years, my dad was a functional alcoholic. He was a functional, he externally to the world, he presented as a very successful businessman. We learn to present a certain style out to the world. You kind of learn what you're allowed to talk about, what you're not allowed to talk about, what's fair game, what's not fair game. In the walls, it was more, he was withdrawn. So he was never really physically abusive, at least to me, or my mother, that I really observed. But he was very emotionally abusive. He did other things that were, manipulative and that kind of thing. So it was more, it wasn't that it was chaotic in the way that most people think of when you think of that, but it was chaotic from an emotional standpoint. So you never really felt like you knew where you stood. Am I going to walk in today and it's going to be good dad, or am I going to walk in today and it's going to be drunk dad?
Right.
And you always feel like you're on eggshells. So yes, it's chaotic, but outwardly, someone looking in from the outside wouldn't have seen the chaos.
Well, that's good. When you think about that, that's pretty good, because they didn't judge you that way, right?
Yeah.
If you think of it that way. Scott, and when you said, your sister's 5 years older than you, and you guys did not get along until you were mature, right? So in other words, is when you understood that there's more value in aligning with someone, right? At a certain age. I think that usually does happen with maturity. Have you found that even your connections, once you matured, got stronger?
The ones that I kept have.
Right.
I would say I'm more selective now in terms of who I form deep connections with. So I tend to have fewer deeper connections than a lot of shallow ones, if that makes sense. That's my preferred method.
I'm with you 100%.
Well, and I mean, you mentioned the CLA, where we met. That's one of the reasons I'm part of groups like that. I'm part of Coach Connections. I'm part of CLA. I find groups that are curated where, I may not like everyone that's in the group or that's not the point. It's not that I have to like everybody, but there's still a sense of community, a sense of, hey, let's help each other.
Right.
We have an abundance mindset, not a scarcity mindset. I try to find groups like that and then form deep relationships with people in those groups, because that's how I look at things. I don't look at things in a competitive or transactional way. I try to look at things as much as I can. Not going to say I succeed at this 100% of the time, but you try to look at things more in a relational way and more in a growth mindset, an abundance mindset kind of way. And so that's the people I tend to form the deeper relationships with.
Oh, I love that, because you're talking up my alley, right? That's how I feel, because the Connected Leaders Academy has over 550 members. We cannot connect with every single one of them. So there are going to
want to.
Right. Because then we don't have the time or the bandwidth, if you will, right, to be able to. I mean, you could probably do that, but it may take many, many months or years to be able to connect with every single person. By then, it should have grown because this continues to move forward. And we also, don't we change daily? I mean,
Sure.
I know I do, right? I try not to be the same guy I was yesterday, because then that guy was boring the way I see him now, right? So,
Yeah, we change, we adapt, our needs
Mhm.
change, and then so does the other person. So
Right.
it's always a moving target, which is one of the reasons why, I think I see people a lot of times uh, in business. This happens where, they'll meet with somebody one time at a networking meeting or whatever, and they're like, oh, I met so and so. And a year goes by and it's like, well, have you followed up? Have you talked to so and so again? And they're like, oh no, I just talked to him that one time. I don't know why they're not sending me referrals, or I don't know why
All
they're not. And it's like,
right.
that's not how that works.
No.
You actually have to curate a relationship. If it's for whatever reason, if it's worth it, either they're aligned with you from a personality standpoint, they're aligned with you from a customer standpoint, they're whatever reasons you have. If there's that alignment, then you can build that relationship. And sometimes you discover, I meet with somebody, it's like, no, there's no alignment here. Okay,
Mhm.
now that person I'm probably not going to seek out and try to follow up with, not because I'm not going to avoid them, but at the
Right,
same
right.
time, I'm not going to put a lot of energy into it because it's not fruitful. Why go plant seeds in a barren field? I'd
That's
rather
right.
spend my
That's right.
time planting seeds in a field that we can get a good relationship from, and have mutual respect and attitudes and that kind of thing. And
Right.
so it is a little bit of finding those people and then curating those relationships. And I think folks don't, they feel like that's somehow manipulative. And I always try
Mm.
to kind of bring up the difference between manipulating people and influencing people. So,
Yes.
manipulating somebody is when I use the skills I have to get you to do something because it's good for me.
Right, 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 right,
And
right.
that's my motivation. This is good for me, so I'm going to get this person to do this to benefit myself. Influences where I'm going to use those same skills, that same relationship, the same conversations, the same everything, but I'm doing it truly with the attitude of, I want to make sure this is good for them.
Right.
It may also be good for me. I mean, it's
Mm.
not that I can't benefit, but it needs to be something that for sure is good for them. They have to benefit from this.
Mm.
Because if they don't, well, then it is manipulation, but you can do that, and that's not transactional, that's relational, because it's
That's
not a
it.
quid pro quo. It's just sincerely, I want something good for the person that I like.
Yeah, that's right. So, Scott, obviously that frame of mind, that thinking, that mindset that you have now, you didn't have that when you were a little kid. I know I
Oh,
didn't.
absolutely not.
So what was your relationships like with friends that you had? How was school for you when you were, even before high school? How was elementary school, junior school? How was high school? Did you play sports? Tell me about that time of your life.
So I was always a nerd, from the very beginning. I've
Mm,
always been the science geek, the math geek. I've always been the, make really good grades. I did have to work for it. I did actually have
mm,
to study in things. I wasn't one
mhm,
of those kids that it was just like everything magically came easy for. But I was definitely a nerd. I had a few friends, most of them not super deep friendships, except that even then it was just a handful of folks that I had a deep friendship with.
right.
I was always kind of the kid that other kids went to for advice, which in
Mm.
high school stunk because it meant all the girls came to me to ask about boys. I was always the friend, right? Later in life that serves you well, but in high school it kind of stinks.
Right,
But
right.
I kind of had all of those sorts of relationships. I was always more of in part because my mom was an educator. So
Mm,
it was, that was kind of my orientation, was towards education. But, my mom tells me that I started coaching when I was like 8 years old, that I basically was always the kid, even preschool, that looked for ways to connect and build other people up.
mm.
And again,
Wow.
it served me well in some ways and not in others. So
Right.
I won't say I was miserable in school or anything, but it was by no means, I'm not one of those people that looks back at high school as like, oh, that was the peak of my life. It's more like, okay, I got through that. College I enjoyed more than high school. But high school, it was really just kind of getting through it, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. One of the things when you were speaking about connecting and so forth, I'm just wondering, because now I even thought of myself, if there was a teacher that I would want to be connected with today. Do you have anybody that comes to mind?
I have a handful of teachers that I actually stayed connected with for a long time. One of my science teachers, Miss Martinez, she passed away a few years ago. I had an English teacher, Miss Brown. I had, there were a handful of teachers that not only did I want to stay connected with them, I actually did. I went back post high school and sought out some of those teachers to tell them, hey, you were a very positive influence on my life, and you were somebody that was important to what I chose to do, how I became who I am, that kind of thing. I think that's something that we don't do enough of. People, people talk about the teachers that were influences, but they never go back and tell the teacher. And as a teacher, I was a teacher for 16 years. It means a lot when a kid comes back and goes, oh, you were a positive influence on my life. So yeah, I definitely had a handful. Mr. Gonzalez, I could keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I moved too much, so I was not able to go back. But I do recall and how impactful they were in my life. So when we think about everybody who's made a huge influence in who you are today, you talked about your mom. Who would you say were some, and you also grew up with all your neighbors being with their parents doing all these crazy and incredible things. Did you along the way get a mentor besides your mom, a coach or somebody that you looked up to that really propelled you in a way that when you go back, you go, oh, now I remember that instance
Well,
at that point?
a lot. Again, I both virtual mentors and real world mentors. And what I mean by that is I've always been a reader. I've always been a learner. I've always been a grower. So, reading books by John Maxwell, and I've since then I've gotten to meet him and actually gotten to be mentored by him a little bit. And, he's tremendous. But he started as a virtual mentor. I didn't even think I'd ever be able to meet him. And then later did. Dan Miller, people like that were always influences in my life. As well, I've connected in person. So like Jeff Brown, who does the Read to Lead podcast, he was a big influence on me starting a podcast and doing that kind of thing. My coaching, Dave Jacobson is one of my mentors, and he's a fantastic coach. And I've learned tons about coaching from him and business and other things. So, and that's the other thing is in the mentor category, I tend to find a mentor. It's not like I have a mentor that's universal in every component of my life. You know what I mean? I have people that I look to, for relationship and marriage advice. And then I have somebody else that it's like, okay, your business, or okay, your podcasting or your whatever, because first off, they have different strengths. And then secondly, I like the idea of not trying to learn from any one person, but finding lots of different people, because even when I'm working with Jeff on podcasting, I'm learning other things. It's because you can pay attention and how's he teaching? How's he connecting? How does he think? You can learn things about people without necessarily learning the content too. So it's two levels, if that makes sense. So that's some of the ones. I mean, again, it's another one of those. I could keep going and naming names. We could spend the rest of this hour with me going, well, that person was an influence and that person was an influence. There's tons of books on the shelves behind me. Every single person. If there's a book back there, it's because it was valuable to me, valuable enough that I kept it, because I've thinned out my book collection over the years. And if it's a book that's not, I read it once and yeah, okay, I've gotten all I'm going to get from that one. I go ahead and sell it or move it on to another owner. But the
Mhm.
ones that manage to stay on my shelves are the ones that continue to be an influence on me. So that's one level of mentorship. And then like John Maxwell, being able to meet him and sit down with him and actually learn from him,
Right,
that's a
right.
huge influence on my life. So a lot of different people in different ways.
When did you love reading? When did that really hit for you?
I'll tell you a family story. So I came home from the first day of first grade
Mm,
and I was furious.
really?
And my mom's like, why are you mad? What's wrong? And I'm like, well, you kept telling me that when I went to first grade, I'd learn how to read. And I don't know how to read yet. And
Mm,
it's literally the first day of school. And my mom's like, oh, geez, okay. So she sat down and taught me to read. And so
mm,
by like the second month of first grade, I'm reading. And
wow.
nobody else in the room is reading. So I started reading the readers. And by the end of first grade, I'd read all of the first grade readers and most of the second grade readers. By the
Mm,
end of second grade, I'd read all of the rest of the second grade readers, all of the third grade readers. By third grade, there were no more readers. I'd read all of them. So they started sending me down to the librarian who became a great influence on my life,
mm,
family friend. And, I
right,
another one of those teachers that made an influence on my life. She was the librarian.
right.
I went down there and I walked in and she's like, okay, what do you want to order this week? And she'd literally pull out the catalog and we'd go through and we'd pick out books and she'd order them.
Wow.
And the next week I'd read those books. And then, so for a long time, about half the books in the elementary school library were books that I had picked out and ordered. It's like they literally was because Scott wanted to read them. That's why they were on the shelf. And so there was science and science fiction and fantasy and, all of these
Right,
things that a lot of elementary school libraries didn't have, but that's what was interesting to me. So that's what she
right.
ordered.
That's pretty
And
cool.
so I've always been, basically when I started reading, I just didn't stop.
Mm,
I usually read between 50 to 100 books a year, nonfiction, not
right,
counting any fiction books I read. I
right,
don't, I still read fiction, but I don't count those.
right.
That's just bubble gum. That's popcorn.
Yeah, right, 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 right.
That's not reading for learning.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. I had a really complex thing on one of my counters, and I had a young man come in with his mother. He was 4.5 years old, and he sits there and he's reading it out loud. And these were complicated words. And I'm like, how old is he? She said 4.5. I'm like, and he can read all this? She goes, yeah, he's been reading. He loves
Mhm,
reading.
mhm,
And so this kid was a client of mine. His mother's also a client of mine, and they've been a client. He just went off to college, and he's going to be, he's going for a doctorate.
mhm.
So it's really interesting when you see somebody so invested in reading or learning that you can't help but help them. I think that that's what the librarian saw in you. She said, like, I need to help this kid. He's somebody that's special, right? Because a lot of, and not in a negative way, but a positive way.
Mhm.
Somebody who really, we cannot allow them to not move forward. And if
Yeah,
we're the catalyst to their catapult, then we should be here, right? We
yeah.
should help them along the way. So yeah, that's incredible. Thank you for that story, because it reminds me of taking my own kids to the library, and they're like, "Oh my gosh!" And they've been to the library, but it was me taking them
Mhm,
and me telling them, nobody's gonna tell you what book you can choose. You can choose whatever book you want. They're like, "Really?" Because a
mhm.
lot of times, they're told what they have to read. It's put in front of them. But was a, you know what? You're in a candy store. It's a different kind of candy store, but you can choose anything you like. And I love the way you talked about, if it's fiction, it's candy, it's popcorn, right?
Right.
But
That doesn't mean it's
nonfiction.
bad. Doesn't
No,
mean you
no,
don't read it,
listen,
but it's
I've read
enjoyment.
tons of, fiction books, but I personally prefer nonfiction because I learn, right? But the
Right.
crazy thing is, I'm sure you've learned also from fiction books,
Oh, of course. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
You
I'm
learn
sure that
different things, but
right,
they're still, and sometimes you just need to be able to, live in a world of imagination.
yeah,
Whether it's playing a video game, whether it's reading a comic book, whether it's reading a fiction book, whether it's watching something on TV. I think all too often we think of all of that stuff as completely negative or completely positive. And
mm,
it's like, it's not that it's negative and it's not that it's positive. It's more, how are you letting this input influence your life,
right,
for back of a letter word?
mhm,
Are you using it, and it's popcorn,
right,
and
right.
you're deliberately going, you know what, I'm going to have a popcorn tonight, and that's okay. It's just like eating. If
Yeah,
all you did was eat junk food all the time, it's not good for you. But does that mean that if you have a little piece of dark chocolate every once in a while, you're going to immediately die? No,
no,
it's not. It's the going to the extremes, I think, that is so bad. But at the same time, most people, they say, haven't read a nonfiction book after they graduated from college.
mm,
Something like 80% of people haven't read another nonfiction book after they graduated from college.
mm.
And it's like, okay, that's also sad,
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to think. I'm like, wow, how would I be if I didn't read, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Napoleon Hill and all these incredible people. What would my thoughts be like? And I
mhm,
think they do influence us, don't they?
absolutely. And again, for good or for ill. But it's being able to sit down at the feet of somebody else and walk through how are they processing a certain idea
Yeah,
or a certain
yeah.
topic. By the way, even there are books out there that I've read that I'm like, yeah, I don't agree with this premise. I don't agree with this way that they're putting this forward. So it's not even the things that you learn that are, oh, I'm going to take that and use that. It's even the things
Mm,
that you learn that are, no, I'm not going to accept this.
yeah,
And again, for good or ill, sometimes it's all about curating not just what goes in to your mind and to your body and to your soul and to your spirit, but then what do you put out into the world too? And there's a
mm,
connection between those two things.
yeah,
If all you ever do is consume a certain kind of literature, you're going to put that out into the world,
that's right.
and again, we end up nowadays in echo chambers because that's how the system is set up. The tools that we use tend to feed us the stuff that we already believe.
Yeah, yeah.
You
There,
have
there
to
was a,
actively seek out contrary information.
you do. There was a time you just reminded me where I was reading the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice, right?
Mhm.
And everything, it was so cool. It was so ooh, and but then you do read other books that are like, wait, they set you back up to like, wait, that's not real. It
Yeah,
doesn't happen, right? So I want to talk about your book that you wrote, right?
sure.
Inspired Living. And I want to get into this a little bit because it says assemble the puzzle of your calling by mastering your time, your talent, and I love this one, your treasures. Why is that so important for anybody to do that with their life, to assemble their treasures? What gifts do we have, or
Mhm.
what hidden ones do we not share?
So all three of those, what I've discovered over the years of working with folks is eh, kind of twofold. One is we have a tendency to look at the world and we think about our time and our money, treasures
Mm,
and time, and we think of them as the limiting thing. It's the thing holding me back. I
right.
don't have enough time. I'm too busy. These sorts of phrasings, or I don't have enough money. I'm
Mm,
broke. Or conversely, by the way, this can also be a limiting one. I make such good money doing XYZ, I can't go over here and do the thing that I really want to do. The
right.
golden handcuffs kind of thing. So we look at these things as limits on our life. And the interesting thing is, what I've discovered over the years is that those are really the symptom. They're not the problem. The problem is in that talent category, because the problem is between our ears and in our heart. The problem isn't time and money. It's how are we managing ourselves that becomes how we manage time and money. They're the reflection of our habits, our behaviors, our beliefs, our values. They're reflected in time and money. That's the old thing of, hey, you tell me what's important to you. And most of the time people will say things like, faith is important, family is important. They'll give you a list. Right. And whatever they put at the top, go, great. Now give me your checkbook or your bank statement or your credit card statement. Give me your calendar, and I'm going to look for those things on those two things. And guess what? If they don't show up, you're lying. Absolutely. They're not really the most important thing to you. If you say your family's important and yet you're always missing your daughter's soccer game or your son's band concert, is family really the most important thing to you? Because you're putting something else before it. Same thing with money. If you say family is important, okay, great. How are you using money to provide for your family, not only now, but into the future? What habits are you teaching them about money? What behaviors are you teaching them about money? So all of these things show up in that third category of talent. And a lot of times that's where what you're talking about with the hidden things show up, because all too often we have giftings that we're ignoring. And we're letting time and money be the excuse. Right. I don't have time. I don't have money. That's why I can't do fill in the blank. I literally had somebody tell me one time, if I go start my own business, I'm going to end up living homeless under a bridge. That's an interesting belief set.
If you believe it, it may happen, right?
Because if that's what you believe, that's what you're going to create. And it's like, wait a minute, how do we reset that belief? And then all of a sudden their behavior changes. And now all of a sudden everything else changes. And it's like, oh, I have plenty of time. I have plenty of money. I'm able to do what I want. And by the way, this isn't a magic wand. This isn't about flipping a switch. The reason why I call it assembling the puzzle is when we start putting all of this stuff together, it is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And what's more, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where the picture on the box keeps changing.
Right.
And sometimes you're missing some pieces. And sometimes someone else has dumped some pieces in your box that belong to a different puzzle.
Right. How do you figure that one out? Wait a minute. Wrong piece. Wrong piece.
This isn't even my piece. This is my mom's piece when she told me I needed to do this. Or this is somebody, somebody has given me things that I've now put into my programming. They're in my box, but they're not really mine. And being able to hold up that piece and examine it and go, you know what? I'm going to choose to not put this piece back in the box. I'm going to throw it away. It's not a piece I need. Okay, great. Throw it away. But it is a conscious, active, intentional process over time to assemble that puzzle. And it's really about the assembly. The process is what matters more than the end picture. Because again, the picture is going to move. It's going to change. What you want out of life today, I bet you if I went back in time and asked 20-year-old you, the list of things that were important to 20-year-old you are probably not identical to the list of things that are important to you now. There's probably some things in common, that are still true. And then there's other things that are like, I didn't see that coming, because your life changes. So it is that assembly process that becomes important. And I think all too often what we're looking for is the end result. And in doing that, we lose track of the journey. We lose track of the value of the uncovering, the discovery, the assembly part of the puzzle.
It's really interesting when we start looking at our lives and the gifts that we've been given, and maybe who has that piece of the puzzle that I'm missing, right? If you look at it that way.
Where do I go get that piece?
Yeah, no, we don't. Let me share this with you and then we'll be right back.
The city never sleeps, and neither do the dreamers who build its pulse. From every corner of the globe they come, Visionaries, creators, leaders, each carrying a spark ready to ignite the world. This is not an event. It's a revolution of rhythm and reason. A symphony of minds. A movement of momentum. Sifu, Rafael, Lancelot, Jose Escobar. Together they set the stage for brilliance. This is the NYC experience. Mastermind, light up the city. They coming from the east, coming from the west. Knowledge on deck, put the truth to the test. Leaders in motion, hearts in sync, dropping wisdom so deep it'll make you think. They bring stories, sweat and flame, different faces, one shared name. Elevation, that's the sound. NYC experience, mastermind, where purpose is found.
That song always makes me move.
I was going to say, I want to dance.
Yeah, it absolutely inspires me to keep going, right? To keep making those connections, to keep putting the puzzles together, because life is a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not. You don't even know there was a piece that was missing until it shows up in a person. It
Yep.
shows up in a place. It shows up in your tomorrow.
In a book that you read, back to the books. Yeah.
So when you considered, you went from becoming a teacher. Tell us why you became a teacher and what subject did you teach?
So I became a teacher kind of in a way by accident. And let me tell you what I meant. So I went to college and I have a degree in biochemistry. I have a second degree in genetics. I got 2 bachelors of science in 4 years. And I did that because at the time I wanted to do medical research. And the motivation is helping people. I've always wanted to change the world, to help people. And that was kind of the drive. And so I started doing medical research. And I discovered that medical research is about 80% chasing grant money and about 20% helping people.
Wow.
And I'm like, I don't want to chase grant money the rest of my life. This just doesn't sound fun.
Right.
So I mentioned earlier, my mom was a big influence in my life. She was a teacher. My dad was actually a teacher for a short time before he went to work for Sears and eventually became his own business owner. So education was kind of in our background. So I said, okay, well, I can become a school teacher and do that for a little while I figure out, what else I want to do.
Right.
And so I pivoted and got what they call an alternative certification, which is a way you can teach without having to go back to school and get a certification in teaching. Started teaching and loved it and did that for 16 years. And as far as what I taught science, which makes sense.
Right.
I had what they call a composite certificate. So technically I could teach any science that they offered. And I've taught every science that the state of Texas offers, with the exception of earth science. I tell everybody I don't do rocks. I do everything else. So I've taught, physics, chemistry, AP physics, AP chemistry, bio, everything, right? Anatomy and physiology, whatever it is. And I've taught from 6th all the way through 12th grade. Then I also became real involved in science reform and kind of changing the way science was taught. So I worked for a lot of projects at a national level, Project 2061, Benchmarks for Scientific Literacy, different science reform movements or systemic change movements at a national level as well. So I did a lot of that, working with teachers all across the nation so that I could kind of help make science teaching better. And eventually I left teaching, just burned out on it. It really, for those of you that don't know, teaching is long hours and very low pay. My wife and I went through a period towards the end of my teaching career where we had a lot of debt, and I was making $40,000 a year. We had over $60,000 in debt. I was actually suicidal because of finance. Number one cause of male suicide, financial stress and strain. My wife and I weren't talking. We weren't communicating. We were probably headed towards divorce. And basically some messaging came into my life. We're back to mentors and, hearing the right things at the right time. And I went to my wife, I sat down with her, I said, okay, we were either going to change this or we just need to go our separate ways. And we decided to change it. And so we came together, started radically changing the way we were living. In the middle of that, I changed jobs, not really because of the money, but it also was, if that makes sense. So I went to work for Educational Testing Service. So I went from teaching to testing. My students said I joined the dark side because, I started writing tests for a living and worked myself up in corporate, did that for 11 years, had an executive position as a corporate, ran a big team on a plane all the time, in hotels all the time, in airports all the time, flying all around the country, doing all of that sort of stuff and client work, and loved that as well, loved developing leaders.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, on the side, as my wife and I radically changed the way we were living our life, people kind of came up to us and went, y'all are weird. Because y'all are weird, because I'm literally making six figures driving a 1999 Ford that it used to be blue, but now it's kind of gray because
It changed.
The headliner up with glue about every 3 days because the sun was melting the glue and it was like falling and hitting me in the face.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm making, good money, and people are like, why are you driving that? Go buy a brand new car. And we're like, nope, we're going to live different. We've got a goal. This is our goal. The car is not important right now. By the way, I drive a nicer car now, but it's that at the time, that wasn't important. We had our priorities, we had our values, we were putting our puzzle together and lining things up. And so people noticed that and they're like, you're weird. So we started coaching people on the side. And as I kind of climbed the corporate ladder, my coaching business started growing. And then I kind of reversed my climb, but went back down the corporate ladder and launched the coaching business as my full-time business. So I started coaching in 2011 formally, but took it full-time in 2017.
I love that. When you talked about the scales tipping, right? What a great way of looking at it, and people didn't understand your mission, and that's why you had the car that you had. Who cares? To me, I'm not a car guy, so I don't really
I'm not
care.
either.
As long as it gets me from point A to point B, right? Because I can spend and unfortunately, I bought my ex-wife really nice cars, and meanwhile I had crappy cars. But she had the really nice Mercedes and all this, and I had like a regular, but for me it wasn't the car. Does it work, and can I get there?
Yeah, that's all I cared about.
That matters, right? But everybody has their own idea of success, right? Some people think that a car or a fancy this, a fancy that is success. But and I always say this all the time: is have you ever seen a funeral procession with a U-Haul truck behind it?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's taking all their stuff with them, right? So it's you can accumulate junk or stuff or fancy stuff, but it doesn't make a difference in your overall life of who you are, who you become.
And it's not that, again, I'm not a live in a cave and only come out on Coupon Tuesdays either.
Some caves are really nice though.
Spend them exactly. Spend the money on the things that actually are important to you. Mm-hmm. And again, there's nothing wrong with having a nice car. I had a past client that, his birthday gift for his wife every year was a brand new Caddy. But he was also in a position where he went in and traded in the old one and then stroked a check for the new one. He did not even, he made over $1 million a year in income, that just his revenue. So he was not, and I'm talking net, not gross. The bottom line revenue was over $1 million a year. So writing a check for a Caddy every year was like,
no big deal.
Like somebody making $100,000 a year buying a $700 junker every year. The ratio was about the same. Correct. And it's like, no big deal. So he could do that. And it was something that his wife valued, and he loved his wife, and he did it for her. Okay, great. No problem with that. But again, notice there's a lot of stuff there, in terms of why he was doing it. Wasn't because he wanted a brand new Caddy to show off. you know, and it wasn't even for his wife to show off. It was, he loved her and she liked them. Okay, I'll get you.
There you
It's
go.
comparable
That
to somebody
works.
buying, buying a scarf because your wife likes a scarf or whatever. There was really no difference in terms of the
Mm,
emotion and the drive. So it's not the stuff; it's our outlook to the stuff. It's why are you getting the stuff? If you're getting a car because you want to impress your neighbors when it's parked in front of the house, that's stupid. You
yeah.
know, I had another client couple. I lovingly call them Ken and Barbie, who they lived in the nicest house on the block. They both he drove a Lexus, she drove a Mercedes. They were brand new, everything shiny, shiny. Member of the
Mm,
country club, everything shiny, shiny. They never entertained in their house. You know why? There was no furniture.
there's no furniture.
They had a mattress to sleep on, a couple of lawn chairs in the living room. That's it. That's what their house furnishings were because they couldn't afford to furnish the house that they lived in.
They live exteriorly, if
They
you
were
will.
living to show off to everyone else. That's it.
Yeah.
And by the way, when they changed their motivation and reset what really they valued, they started living differently and they loved life more.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, look, we're actually happier. It's like, fancy that, And
Hello.
and it's funny because again, it wasn't the stuff. They were buying the stuff because they thought that's what would
Mm,
make them happy. They were
right.
showing off for other people because they thought that was what would add value to their life. But when they really figured out what they valued, it wasn't the stuff,
Mm,
and then they could realign their life. And by the way, they still had nice stuff. I mean, both of these people were
mm,
very high income, very,
right, right.
all of that. They still had nice stuff, but they were no longer concerned about how did it look to everyone else.
Mm.
They reset for a while so that then they could have nice stuff without the stuff having them. you
Yeah,
know,
that's really the key, right? Not because a lot of people work for stuff
right.
instead of having stuff work for you, and I
Instead of,
think that's the smarter way to do things,
yep.
right, in life. Um, Scott, I got to tell you, you and I connected not long ago, and then
Mhm.
I'm happy we did, right? Because the value that I can see that you bring not only to your clients but the people that you are surrounding yourself with is it's next caliber, I'm going to say.
Thank you.
And so your book, it's also forward, and you mentioned him earlier, by Dan Miller. Tell us
Mhm.
about your connection with Dan Miller.
So Dan was again first a virtual mentor, in that I read his books. He's the author of 48 Days to the Work You Love, No More
Mhm.
Mondays. He had a podcast that I listened to, and he was one of those folks when I was going through that idea of, maybe I don't want to be a teacher. Maybe I don't want to be in corporate for the rest of my life. Maybe I want to
Mm.
start my own thing. What is this going to look like?
Right, right.
Reading his stuff was really impactful on me and made a lot of changes. After that, I got to meet him. I got to mastermind with him.
Mm.
I got to spend time with him. And I may get emotional here in a second. So I had written the book working with a friend of mine who's a writing coach, because I am not a writer. So
Mm.
I do what I recommend other people do. When I don't have that skill set, I go find somebody who can help me.
Very smart.
And I hire them and they help me, he's always like, you don't have to tell anyone that I helped you write it. I'm like, yes, I do. It's fine. His name's Nick Pavlidis, a great guy. And I had met him many years ago. He was a close friend. He was also connected to Dan Miller. I was connected to Dan, and I'm like, I
Mm.
really want Dan to write the forward. So I'm going to reach out to him. What do you think? And he's like, okay, reach out to him. He's like, let me tell you, he says, send it to him on a Wednesday. And Dan normally writes his forwards and stuff. He'll write them on the weekend and he'll send it to you on Monday. He never
Mm.
sends a forward except on Monday. So you'll get it by Monday. And I'm like, okay.
Oh, interesting.
Reached out to Dan, said, hey, would you be willing? He says, send me over the manuscript. I'll take a look. I'll let you know. Because he doesn't actually write forwards without reading the book.
Right.
Fancy that. So I sent him over the manuscript. And Friday morning, I get back an email and it says, hey, Scott, here's the forward. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is Friday. He doesn't do this. What's going on? And he says, I sat down and I read the book and I was so happy with it. and so happy with, what you put together that I couldn't help myself. I went ahead and wrote the forward and sent it over to you. And I'm like,
Mm.
and I had tears in my eyes the whole bit because I was
Sure.
honored that he'd done that.
Yeah.
The rest of the story is about 2 weeks later, he was traveling with his kids and got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer.
Mm.
And he passed away about 3 weeks later.
Wow.
So my forward was one of the last 5 that he wrote. So which I'm honored that he did. It's one of those stories where it's like, again, looking back at it, I'm a person of faith. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's meant to happen that way.
Right.
But at the same time, he's a huge influence on my life before, during, after,
Right.
and every time I read the forward, I get emotional because it is something that really means a lot to me that he spent extra time. Again, he's a busy guy, he's very regimented in what he does and when he does it. So I know he broke his routine. So I'm kind of like, okay. So I was honored by that as well.
Wow. That's super special, and to have that honor. I mean, wow. Not only did you follow him and he helped you along the way, but you had him write you forward, which is
Mhm.
pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. Let me share one more video with you, and we'll be right back. You followed the rules, tried the restrictions, counted the carbs, the steps, and the failures. You're not lazy, you're exhausted from doing it all without real change. What if the problem isn't you, but the plan? Sifu's Mind-Body Method is a 90-day transformation built on 7 unshakable pillars: mindset, movement, nutrition, hydration, fasting, journaling, and faith. This isn't another shortcut. It's your structure, your strength, your reset. You don't need harder, you need better. Ready to begin? Start today. Let me ask you, you mentioned it a couple of times, your show. You started your own show, and you mentioned that you had an influence behind that. Talk to us about that. Talk to us. What's the name of your show? Because let's give it props, and maybe you will get some listeners over there.
So my podcast is called Inspired Stewardship. And it is that idea, the worldview is that we can become better stewards of our time, our talent, and our treasures, live out our calling, and make an impact on the world. And that's kind of what the show is about. And yeah, Jeff Brown was kind of the coach for me when I started that. He has a podcast called Read to Lead, which fantastic podcast, by the way. It's all about books that you should read if you're a leader, and how leaders are readers and readers are leaders. And then I started the podcast because, quite frankly, I like to talk more than I like to write. So I was like, I can do a blog, I can do this, I can do that. Hey, I like to talk. I should do a podcast. And so again, I found somebody who was good at it and hired them and said, teach me how to do this. And started the podcast in 2018 in January. And my commitment was, I'm going to do this for at least 6 months and see whether or not I like it. My joke is I still haven't figured out whether or not I like it, so I'm still doing it because, honestly, I love it. And that's on it. The book came out of the podcast. The content came from the podcast. The Dan Miller, I had him on my show, and, of course, I connected with him in other ways. Nick, the guy who was my coach, came through the podcast. The people I interviewed in the book, met them through the podcast. Everything about this book. So I tell people I didn't really write a book. I talked a book because I don't like to write. So I figured out another way to do it, and I hired people that would help me with it. So the show started back then. At one time I was doing it 6 days a week. So I've got about 1,600 episodes in the can. interviews and solo episodes, a combination of both. Like all podcasters, I will tell you, don't go back to the first 100 or so episodes and listen to them. Listen to them after that, they get better. But they're out there in the world, and I continue to love it. Both the people I meet through interviewing, as well as I process information by talking about it. And so it turns out it's a great way to do it, and then put it out there into the world, and other people get value from it too.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about the connections and all the different shows that you've had, but it's really the connections, right? That's why I love what I do too, right? Because look, I'm getting to know you so much more, because yes, this is conversational, but I'm giving you the space to tell me about you, because if I wasn't interested, why would I even bother, right? So it's about showing interest in another human being, that there may be something that you say and you go, wow, I love that idea, or I never thought of it that way, right? And I think this is why we need to be open when we have a conversation with another person, and it shouldn't be about us, right? It should be about them. Let me find out about you.
I call putting it on the curiosity cap.
Oh yeah.
You just put on your curiosity hat and say, I'm curious, tell me.
So you talked about your book, right? And how it came from your podcast, really, with all the different people. You had Dan on your show. Dan was gracious enough to say yes to send the information over, but then he went a step further, that was unnormal, right, for him. And he brought it to you 3 days earlier than normal. But how long did and who persuaded you to even write the book? Because you said you're gonna, instead of writing, you like to speak, and I think speaking is such a great gift that we have, right? So how did the book come about?
I think, like most of us, I've always had the idea of, I want to put some of this stuff down in a book. And I want to get a book out in the world. I think most people kind of have that hidden book inside themselves. And by the way, I encourage you to get it out into the world too. But the idea was, okay, I've been coaching people for quite a while at that point, and I've got these kind of nuggets and this kind of framework that I've put together that seems to work for a lot of folks. And I've seen happen a lot with books is people write what I call a process book. And again, nothing wrong with it. That's not a bad thing. But the problem with the process book, or the weaknesses of a process book, is it works if you start at the same point and have the same goal. So if I set down my process for doing something and share it with you, but your background or your personality or your history is different, you're not starting from the same place.
Right.
And if your goal is different, you're not trying to end at the same place. And so now you have to modify the process. By definition, you're going to have to change it. And so a lot of times we read a book and we try to implement what it tells us to do, and it doesn't work. And then we're frustrated because we feel like something's wrong with us. I must not have done it right. And it's like, well, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's also because the book was set up for a different person, starting from a different point. And again, doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Because if you are starting at that point, man, this book is going to rock your world, but sometimes we read the wrong book. And so I decided, look, instead of approaching this from a process point of view, I want to approach it from a framework point of view. And a framework is something that applies regardless of where you start. And regardless of what your goal is, it's a way of looking at something as opposed to a way of doing something. And so you may do it different ways, but your goal, your outlook, your frame is the same. So we talked earlier about like relationships and nurturing relationships. I am a very task-oriented person. Okay, talking to people does not come naturally to me. It comes naturally to my wife. We walk into an airport. My wife has 3 friends before we pick up the lunch, and I'm going, are we having dinner with someone tonight? What's going on? It's like, it's completely foreign to me. So what I do, I have to turn nurturing relationships. I turn it into a process. I do it a certain way. So it's very deliberate and it's intentional, and I have a process and things. So that process works for me. It would not work for my wife.
Right.
But the framework of I need to develop relationships, I need to nurture those relationships, I need to become curious, I need to be, like you said, more interested in them than me. I need to, look for the wins for this, all of that stuff. That's a framework that applies regardless of how you do it. My wife does it naturally, I do it deliberately, but we're both doing the same framework. And so in the book, that's what I took the approach of. I want to put together frameworks around how we look at time, how we look at treasures, and how we look at ourselves, the talent component, so that regardless of where you're starting, regardless of what your goals are, you can apply these frameworks and begin to shift the way you see the world, the way your behavior, your beliefs, and your habits to shift into a new place.
I love it. I love it. We can talk for a long time. I can see that. I can see that. Thank you for the time that you spent with me today and sharing your story and your ideas and your anecdotes, if you will, and your book as well. When we see at the bottom of the screen, your website is going up. Tell us about that. You have 45 seconds, and then we will. We'll tell everybody what they need to do after you tell them that. Go ahead.
Okay. So I put together a landing page just for your listeners. If you go to inspiredstewardship.com coaching call /coaching call, what I put on there is there's some free resources. So those areas of time, talent, and treasures, if you want some help with those, there's free resources you can download. If you want to purchase the book, there's a link to find the book, as well as information about my podcast. And then I also put a link on there where if you just want to jump on a call and have a conversation, no sales pitch, that's not what it's about. Right. Maybe this is an area, something I said resonate, and you want to hear some more about it. There's a place that you can jump on and have a conversation as well. So you can find all of that over at my website and then /coaching call.
Love it. Wow. Thank you so much for doing that. And everybody, make sure you go to inspiredstewardship.com /coaching call. I got to tell you, what a great show that you allowed me to have with you today. And every time I learn something from someone, so thank you for sharing that information and your knowledge. This is what I'm going to recommend to everybody who's watching. Share it with somebody who couldn't watch it today. Maybe they watched the replay, but if you consider all the information that we all learned today from Scott, we're all better for it. So Scott, thank you, my friend. What a pleasure. What an honor to have you on the show. Everybody, do me a favor. Let me know what you thought of the show. Go ahead and let us know. Also, share it. Share it. Sharing is caring, right? So thank you. Make sure you check out Scott's show as well. It's Inspired Stewardship, right? And let's have some fun. All right, everybody, have a blessed day, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.